how I got to this point. I think it's important at some point for me to explain how I reached the conclusions I have. And that I would say that when I started thinking about this back in the the early 70s, some of us can remember the 1970s, that during that time that I was one of the few pastors that were intentionally trying to figure out how to make disciples in the local church in the way that I'm talking about it. And there were really no books from pastors about that issue. There were parachurch people writing about the subject. But I've been on this journey, and I just want to try to explain it to you. And we'll start with a quote from that august guru of philosophy and theology at the University of Southern California, Dallas Willard. Dallas Willard, I wrote a tribute to him in a journal, and I said the thing about him is he's avuncular. That means like an uncle. He's the kind of guy that you would sit on the front porch and listen to all day long. He just emits wisdom. And that things that normally bother us, like that we're anxious about in our life, it doesn't seem to bother him. On his 75th birthday, I congratulated him and wished him many more birthdays. He says, well, I don't think about that. I don't have any control over it. I just go one day at a time. And I thought, that's a novel idea. One day at a time. But Jesus actually taught that, communicated that. And so that is a great goal for all of us. But he says, why Christian faith, or you could even say the Christian faith, has failed to transform the masses and make a more just and peaceful world. So that's quite, if we stop right there, that's quite a statement. Why Christian faith has failed to transform the masses and make a more just and peaceful world is because it has failed to transform the human character. You see, this goes back to the kind of gospel we preach. If the gospel we preach is really just about getting our sins forgiven and getting into heaven, getting that pass we need for heaven, and then that's the starting line and the finish line, if that's the way it is, which is the way it is in the large part of America, even in our basic, fundamental, evangelical, conservative churches, it's not that we don't talk about that other stuff, it's just that other stuff is optional, not fundamental. Because it has failed to transform the human character. So if we don't transform, we don't see the transformation in the human person, the condition, into a person who is filled with the Spirit and who is walking in the Spirit, a person who is exhibiting the fruit of the Spirit, walking in their giftedness, etc. When that's the exception rather than the rule, then you don't get this transformation of human character, because it most often is not accompanied by discipleship. Again, discipleship is a lifelong learning from Jesus how to live our lives as though He were living it. It means that, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, that Jesus He's the end of all. He's end of all. He is all of it. Jesus Himself is the full 100% content of we need to know what to do in this life. He's taught us that. In philosophy, program, or curriculum. So let's talk about philosophy as our beliefs. And that really is kind of what the leaders of your congregation or the leaders of your ministry, the people that you hang out with, what they believe, what's really important. Like, for example, you can read church mission statements or purpose statements, and oftentimes it'll say things about worship. It'll say things about the Great Commission. It'll say a lot of things. But it doesn't really have enough focus to please me, to be honest. I like the idea that, worship, the quality of worship, and we're talking now about praise, about music, about what we call a worship service, the kind of public worship, the celebration, is directly contingent upon the vibrancy of the people who are doing it. If you get a certain kind of classification of person together, you're going to get a much, I would call, vocal, heartfelt, powerful worship experience. Then if you take a group of people who are sort of passive-aggressive, semi-obedient people, and who say, well, jack me up, get me excited, give me, worship is something they want you to do to them. It's kind of like the two guys that go into worship and they come out and one says, I didn't really care for that. And his friend said, that's all right, we weren't worshiping you. So the first guy didn't get it, the second guy got it. So it's what your philosophy is, and the philosophy is driven by Scripture. So what do we say the Scripture says about us and about who we are and what our purpose in life is? And remember what C.S. Lewis said and what I have said is that it's the only thing we've been authorized to do. Jesus didn't tell us to go out and organize churches. He really didn't. And this is the way you organize the churches, and this is the way you do this, the way you do that. Essentially, he told us to be disciples and to make disciples. You guys, who you are, go make more of them. Now, there was a lot of factors involved in doing that, but we're talking at the core. In program really talks about your church infrastructure. And I spent about 15 years of my life starting an organization that was designed to help churches. You probably never heard of it, but it was called TNET International, Training Network International. And what we would do is we'd work with churches in order to help them build an infrastructure that was friendly to their beliefs. For example, let's say you want to be a disciple and make disciples. Okay, how do you make disciples? Well, then the way you run your worship services, the way you run your Sunday school, the way you develop your small groups, what you're doing with the development of people on an individual basis, that all needs to match. Your church's heart's desire is to make disciples and be disciples, so your church infrastructure then should match that. And quite often, one of the great disparities, one of the great difficulties in trying to do this was that the heart's desire of the people of the church and the leaders of the church would be to do that very thing, but their infrastructure militated against it. And so because their infrastructure militated against it, it was like beating your head against the wall all the time. Pretty soon, when I first took my son to the nursery when he was quite young, I put him in the nursery, and the first thing he did was he ran against that little Dutch door. He ran and banged himself against the Dutch door, and he fell down, and he got back up, and he ran and threw himself against the Dutch door, and then he did it a third time, and the lady says, what do I do? What do I do? I said, he'll be okay. Once it hurts his head, he'll stop. And as soon as I walk away, he'll stop, frankly. But so if you keep hitting your head against something, eventually you'll stop. And that's what a lot of people experience. Now, the third thing is curriculum. Curriculum is just a Latin word for race course. And that's really what the content is. Now, one of my best friends in life is a guy named Larry Osborne. Larry pastors a church with a gazillion people in North County of San Diego. And he built this based on two really innovative things. One was called the Video Cafe, where he has like 28 different kinds of worship venues. If you want worship at 8:30 in the morning with people between the ages of 35 and 37 who are all wearing baseball caps, you can get that. And so it really genuflects to all that difference in taste and all that, but it was all about space. And so he started the Video Cafe kind of thing. The other thing was that the sermon-based small group. So he would teaches the Bible, and then people discuss the sermon during the week. And that's pretty common now. A lot of people do that. Now, one of the things that can happen is that can be a rather dynamic, really good situation, or it can be a panacea, and it can be a problem. And the way it can become a problem is, what are the people actually doing when they get together in the groups? What is their leaders training? What is the expectation of the leader? What is going on? What are you studying? What's the actual content of your study? Are you studying anything you want, or are you studying something that is consistent with the values and the teachings of the church that we're trying to accomplish in the area of discipleship? Is the group challenging people or indulging people? What is it doing? Is it caring for people or training people? What is it doing? You have to answer these kinds of questions. There are different kinds of groups for different kinds of things, but you should know what your groups are doing and why they're doing them, whether the group's open or it's closed. For example, there are many church services that are closed groups. You have a sign out front, you advertise in the paper, but your church behaves as a closed group on Sunday morning. And the reason you do that is because of, let's say, there's certain barriers you put up. There are inside baseball things you do. And so people feel uncomfortable when they come in and they're outsiders. Or you provide it as an open group. So there's different dynamics that we taught all this kind of stuff to people. And so it's content and what people are exercising to do. So the Christian faith has failed to transform the masses because of the lack of human character transformation, and it falls down to these three areas of what do you believe, and what is your organization, and thirdly, what is it you're teaching actually. Now, that's the problem, part of the challenge for us. Now, there's a problem with the gospel and the church in America, and it's right up there. That's the fruit of about 8 or 9 years of work. Now, the only reason it took it 8 or 9 years was because if you get a group of theologians and pastors together and you say, what is the problem with the church? And you meet 3 times a year, you have stacks of papers, and you have all these meetings and all these discussions, and you're trying to be diplomatic about everything. And this is what happened. Now, the only reason I got it condensed down to this was one day, I'm on the plane, and I'm very tired. And I sit down next to this guy, and I had this was when the iPod had just first come out. So I have an iPod, and he has an iPod. This is wonderful. We're not going to talk. So I sat down, and I said, hi. And he said, hello. And then he says, well, what have you been doing here in Minneapolis? It happened to be Minneapolis, the meeting. I said, boy, how am I going to tell him? How am I going to explain this? I said, so what I've been doing is there's a group of us that have been meeting together for several years, and we've been asking and trying to answer the question, is there a problem with the church? And this guy goes, cha-ching. That was when that cha-ching thing was popular on television. I saw that, by the way, on that big sign, a casino sign, cha-ching, when I came through here. Somebody named Gary had made a lot of money or something. And I just guarantee you Gary still doesn't have that money, but he got on the billboard anyway. So I said, well, and he said, cha-ching. Of course there's a problem. Everybody knows there's a problem. He says, I grew up as a Lutheran in Iowa. I know there's a problem with the church. And so I go, well, very enlightening. And so I didn't think I needed to tell him anymore, because who would want to know what this group had decided? But he said, well, what did you decide? He said, what's the problem? And now I'm on the spot, because I think the most condensed version we had was 1 page. And he tried to and so I'm on the spot. So this is what I told him. That many people have been taught and believe that you can become a Christian without becoming a disciple. Or another way of saying it, you can become a Christian without following Jesus. That's the problem. And he goes, oh, you mean like say you believe something, but you don't really? I said, yeah, that's sort of like it. I thought, we could have saved ourselves a lot of money here and a lot of time. Huh? This guy in 21A knows the answer. I'm in 21B. This is all we needed. And so we started talking. And I said, you know how it is that become a Christian. Oh, and if you really want to, you can be a disciple, because that's a special kind of Christian, a disciple. A Green Beret for Christ. Somebody willing to do hand-to-hand combat for Jesus with the desperados out there. And so discipleship is optional. It's like buying an automobile. You know, if you want it used to be, we talk about white sidewalls, but now it's not an issue any longer. But now it's, do you want the moon roof? Would you like the leather seats? Would you like the satellite radio? You know, the different options. And so discipleship was sort of put in that option area. And where also grace was passive. Grace, redefining these words are important. The word grace, a lot of people go, I remember back in 48 when I experienced God's grace. Well, what they're referring to is when they became a Christian, and it's sort of like some big dollop of grace fell out of the sky and went plop right on top of them, and that was when they experienced God's grace. And grace is something that envelops all of our lives for all of life. Grace is what we burn a lot of every day. I burn up all kinds of grace every day. Grace is what God is doing for us that we can't do for ourselves, which is just about everything. And that's God's grace. It's not just something that happened, it's something that's happening. And then we teach faith as agreement. I've already mentioned this to you, but my friend Dallas Willard, Dennis's friend as well, said that part of the problem with being a Christian when he was growing up as a Southern Baptist was that when you got saved, you were stuck with it. Meaning that you would go forward like my wife did when she was 9 at a Wednesday night at a revival, and she got saved. And then that was it. I mean, there wasn't much instruction. They didn't tell her much after that. And so she just said, go to church. Go to church Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, training union, all that. But she wasn't being tutored in the Christian life. And so that's the idea of faith is something that's active. Faith is only real in obedience. Otherwise, it's not faith. Faith's primary property is action. There's a mystery to faith. I mean, it's not exactly only action. It is has a property that's primarily action. And it's something that God gives us. He gives us that faith. He gives us His grace. He gives us the ability to do these things. But it's only real in obedience. That's what James teaches us in chapter 2, verses 14 through 17. So now here I am sitting next to this guy, and I've talked to him a little bit. And he says, well, what's the solution? So he is a curious guy. He wants to know what the solution is. And before I tell you the solution, or you read ahead in your notes, I want to show you this. We spend a little bit of time on this. The gospel. Now, you say, where did you get this? I made it up myself. So what you ever like or dislike about it, you can credit me or blame me. This is the kind of gospels, this is some of the qualities of the gospel we preach in America. First is the forgiveness-only gospel. This might be the first and most popular one, along with the consumer gospel, but it's forgiveness only. Be forgiven. What it creates is following Christ is optional. It's sanctified passivity. As someone said, we've not only been saved by grace, we've been paralyzed by it. You know, that we sing about grace, we love to talk about grace, and gee, it's all by grace, not by works. Nobody would want to work. Nobody would want to put forth effort. That would be legalism. No, it isn't. Paul talks and extols effort, but I'll get to that later. So, it creates in us the kind of person that primarily sees the Christian life as something that I have in my inheritance among the saints, and I'm going to heaven. I'm going to spend eternity with Jesus, and everything else that happens from now on is optional. If I have time, if things work out for me, if I'm not fighting, don't have extra things to do at work, if I'm not busy with the kids, if I'm not, all that stuff, then I'll have time to do some things at church. And that's kind of the way people think when we've been trained to think that way. Then the gospel of the left, the old and the new, I don't want to spend a lot of time on that because I don't think that's really particularly relevant to this group. But essentially the old left would be old liberalism that started back really became strong in the first 50 years of the 20th century. Union Theological Seminary, Harry Emerson Fosdick, Reinhold Niebuhr, Richard Niebuhr, Henry Sloane Coffin, all these people in New York City at Riverside Church, and they were famous. They were on Harry Emerson Fosdick was on the cover of Time magazine over 20 times when it really mattered to be on the front of Time magazine. These people were on television when it came into being in the 1950s. They were liked by the aristocracy of our country and the elite. They were Eastern Seaboard intellectuals, and so they were quite popular. And so that was the old left. The old left lost it, essentially lost their message, and their churches are pretty much empty today. And the reason for this was they tried to be relevant. And this is, I believe, the message for us in this. They tried to become relevant. And they thought the way to become relevant is to try to re-explain the Bible in such a way that take the miracles out of it, take out those primitive ideas of a barbaric society, that all that stuff about miracles, walking on water, turning water into wine, all that kind of business, and let's get right down to what we really can believe. And they did it, and they lost their message. The new left are basically those who don't question the authority of Scripture. What they do is they say we need to reinterpret the Scripture. So the idea would be the Bible doesn't really say we're going to hell or anyone's going to hell. Maybe Hitler and Stalin and Mao and maybe a few other people are going to hell because they should. But nobody else really is going to hell. And the Bible doesn't really teach that. I mean, read these verses and think about it the way I'm thinking about it. And so they've done a lot of that. They sort of say, there was one book written by Phyllis Tickle, who is a Catholic writer, and she said every 500 years the church goes up into its attic and throws out everything that they don't need. And so right now, in the year 2000, we started throwing things out of the church attic that we don't need anymore, like going to hell, Jesus is the only way to God, that homosexuality is a problem, and it goes on from there. So it's all that kind of stuff. We don't have to get into it, but that's kind of the grocery list. So and so that's the old and the new, and that gospel is the new left is really in, I guess, the larger evangelical camp, and that's what you should be alerted to. And again, it's about relevancy, trying to be relevant. So I went to a church in Minneapolis a number of years ago, and the first service was the traditional service with the robe choir, and we all wore coat and tie. And then during the break, the pastor said, okay, now for the contemporary service. So no robes on the choir, they wore their street clothes. And he took off his tie, took off his jacket, and put a gold chain around his neck. And that waited the contemporary service. So trying to be hip. As I like to say, I tried to put hip back in discipleship, but then I found out it was an artificial hip. So, thank you for that. Yes. I'll let you. You can always tell the jokes I write. They're all like that. Okay. Now, the prosperity gospel. This is the prosperity gospel essentially is a part of the larger charismatic church. Most of the charismatic church does not teach prosperity, but there's a certain segment that does. And certainly my roots at Oral Roberts University as a student, prosperity doctrine was taught there when I was a student, and to some degree continues to be, but it's not nearly like that. But all you got to do is watch television, to know this. And so but I think what it creates is entitlement. And I see the fundamental problem with prosperity doctrine is it's God management. I'm managing God into doing what I need. And that, I'm not going to say any more about that. We could be here all day. We're going to be here all day anyway. So the consumer gospel is more relevant, I think. You put that together with the forgiveness only, and they're like kissing cousins. It's about meeting my needs, and what it creates is self-indulgent people who are impatient, addicted to desire. I mean, there are people who leave churches because, well, I can just give you a few of the reasons people have left churches I've pastored. There was one woman who said, "You don't make me cry." And she meant that in a positive way, I think, that I didn't tell the kind of stories that made her feel like crying. Or the music's too loud. Or you remind me of my father and I didn't have a good relationship with him. And those are some of the milder ones. I gave a talk once on sex, and it's called The Urge to Merge. And I thought it was pretty cute, and a woman came out and said, "That's the worst thing I've ever heard." So I had a woman one time grab me. You have to take this by faith. When I was about 31, I had an afro. He had to go get a perm, and so I had this perm. It was real popular. I see they're coming back. I saw the guy the other day with an afro. I almost stopped him and said, "Man, I used to have one of those." But I just thought, who wants to hear from some guy like as old as me? I used to have a fro. So, but I had this fro, and this woman came up to me and she grabbed me by the hair. She's a member of the church. She grabs him and she says, "Is that real?" My wife said I should have grabbed her and said, "Is that real?" Church work. So that's about the consumer gospel, okay? Where people just let their desires run their lives, and then the right answer on the test is kingdom, which is the follow me gospel. And what it creates is activists, followers intent on learning to live as Jesus lived. So that's just to give you just a general overall idea of what the gospels that are being taught in our country are. And I can tell you that every one of them has something positive and good in it. It's just trying to extract out of them the problems that each has. Now, just this guy sitting next to me. We're still on the airplane. He's in 21A, I'm in 21B. And he says, "What's the solution?" I said, "The solution is to exercise a faith that embraces discipleship." In other words, a faith that embraces following Christ. Not a passive faith, not a paralyzed faith, but an active faith. A faith that embraces, says, discipleship. I want to follow you, Christ. That's part of my everyday life. Now, when this happened, I said something else to him. And because he said, why are you doing all this? And I said, well, and this is about leading with my weakness rather than my resume. I told him that I'd spent a lot of my life beating my head against the wall, trying to, when I was a young man, I was in Campus Crusade for Christ, and it was a young man's organization. And I was 25 years old, and they put me in charge of trying to reach all the athletes in America. You know, I remember that was, and other guys, they would take him in a room and say, okay, Fred, you take Africa, and Joe, you take Latin America, and Jerry, you get North America. And so they give them continents. You know, you have a continent to reach for Christ. And so we had this burden upon us as young men and women that you put the trying to reach the world and change the world, you put it on your shoulders and you carry it around. And I said, I found that didn't work. So then I started to try to change the church. And I would pastor a church. I was writing about it, and it was my job. You know, you have to have a mission statement. You've got to have a statement that's audacious. It's got to be impossible. It's got to be ridiculous. It's got to be something that you're going to have to raise tons of money for, and it's going to make a huge impact on the whole world, and that's your job, to change the church in all the world. And I said, I tried that for a long time, and people got really upset. And so I've given up on that. So I gave up on trying to change the world, and I gave up on trying to change the church. I said, really, I'm just working on me now. And he began to cry. He turned away from me, and he just looked out of the window, and his ears got red, and he slumped over, and it was very awkward. And I was kind of trying to get a look at him out of the corner of my eye, because, you know, I didn't want to touch him. That would kind of been odd. So and then he turned back, and he says, well, I've hit a lot of walls in my life too. And there was the door wide open. All I had to do was walk through and tell him. When I talk about choosing a life, choose a life of humility, submission, obedience, and sacrifice, this is the kind of life that Jesus lived, and it's found in Philippians chapter 2, that those qualities in that famous passage in chapter 2, verses 5 through 8, that Jesus' core competency, his core thing about him was his humility and submission, obedience, and sacrifice. And so, I want to tell you a little bit about a process I went through. God had been working on me for several years. And I went back into pastoring after I'd been traveling the world and after I had a big reputation and written on all these books and everything. So I'm asked if, I ended up going back into a church. I kind of thought of it as an interlude, a rest, or a place to be more contemplative, to get to know God more intimately. And so I was spending a lot of my time with people that were helping me along these lines, some of the same people that we worked on all these issues. And so I got to the point where I was going to do a sermon series called Choose the Life. Because you have to be intentional. You know, you can't just drift into this. It's something you have to intentionally decide to do. So I told him I didn't know how long it would be. I didn't know how long the sermon series would be. I really wasn't sure. And I think we have a little power. We do have power now. Okay. All that time we didn't have power. Yeah. Well, somebody can. I'll come keep talking here. So, because you have notes, and I'll fix this in the break. I was. So I got up on Sunday morning to preach, and we had 51 new members that day, and they were up on the platform. And so they handed them certificates of membership, and we had about another 30 a month earlier. So now we have about 80 people that have joined our church in a matter of 5 to 6 weeks. And they all went through a class and all that. So I get, people are celebrating, and they're going to have a meal outside afterwards, and people are going to be able to really have a wonderful time celebrating. So I get up and I say, well, I think that's really great that people want to join our church, but I'm wondering, should we bring them into something that's not working? And you should have seen the looks on their faces change. I mean, they were going, what did he just say? He's finally snapped. Sort of the fan belt in my brain went wing, went off. And I said, no, really, let's think about this. I feel like I'm a fly fisherman, and I'm casting my line, but I'm on ice, and it goes out and it falls onto the ice and goes zap, and I roll it back in, and then I throw it out again and zap, and bring it back in. And I can see transformation. I can see people's lives being changed. I can see all the things that the Acts of the Apostles talks about. I can see the things I want to do, but I just can't. There's just something wrong. I just can't get at it. And now some people are starting to nod their head. Okay? And I said, something's wrong because we have all this activity without change. We have all these books I've written. We have these brochures that explain how you're going to become a Christian leader and all these kinds of things. It's all out there, but yet it looks like we're not really seeing any of that happen, and I don't know why. Our discipleship is superficial. We're doing the right things. We're just finishing curriculum, but I feel like I'm on a treadmill. And our preaching is losing to environment. We talk about evangelism, but are we doing it? How many of us, I preached that sermon so many times, look at this room. Now, if every one of you in this room could reproduce yourself at least once this next year we have 20 people. Wouldn't that be great? But that's not the way life works, actually. So, the preaching is, you can talk about evangelism, but if their leaders are not doing evangelism, then preaching loses to environment. If you talk about love and reconciliation, but leaders aren't talking to one another, they're not living the life in a way that's people are being reconciled to one another, then it doesn't matter if you're talking about love. If the environment is not love, it doesn't matter. It's like Karl Barth, the theologian, who said he was like preaching, it was like blowing a trumpet, and you blow it as hard as you can, and your face gets big and blown up and blue, and you're blowing as hard as you can, but nothing comes out of the end of the trumpet. And I said, my competence has failed me. There was one thing that people always said about me: he's competent. But now I couldn't get my claws into him. I couldn't cast my spell. It was like a king-size mattress with no handles. It kept falling on me. I couldn't do anything with it. It was like a cul-de-sac. And so I found out that I had some deeper issues. For example, I was hooked on results. It was my drug of choice. Spiritual fast food. You know, I read a study not long ago. It said that a group of pastors were asked, what are the 5 most important things about how you know God's blessing your church? Number 1, the energy in the music service. Number 2, the sermon. What do people think of it? Number 3, are people joining groups? Number 4, attendance. Number 5, finances. Now, I would say all 5 of those are important, but I don't think they should be ranked like that. I think there's some other things that are even more important. But, when I realized when I read the 23rd Psalm, the first line, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, and I wanted a lot of stuff, and I was pretty needy. And, the most nervous my reoccurring nightmare was I'm going to go to church on Sunday and nobody's going to show up. And then when I get there and I'm sitting down in the front row and you kind of peek around to see how many people are there because there's really nobody when the church starts, especially the first service, there's really nobody there but you and the worship team. And then people start rolling in. At least that's a California problem. People start rolling in and you turn around, you start feeling better because there's more people there. And then if there's a lot of people there, you're feeling really good. But I thought, why am I enslaved to this? I'm enslaved to my joy, how I feel about myself. All these kinds of things are dependent on how many people show up, what the offerings are, all this kind of thing, all these metrics. And I'm addicted to control. This was another thing it was hard for me to admit, and that was this. The reason I wouldn't give myself 100% to the church was, what if the church ends up being ordinary? What if it just turns up being regular? The thing I was most afraid of in life was being average. Is this really, if this was all there was and I was serving you, Lord, would that be enough? Answer was no. So these are the things that God is showing me about myself. I needed recognition. I was reading this article about Rick Warren. When I was a young pastor, Rick Warren was even a younger pastor, and he was not even starting Saddleback Church, but he came to my church, which was in the Saddleback Valley. And he came a couple of times, and I remember looking at him and thinking, he'll never make it. So much for my procrastination, my prophetic ability. And so I was reading about Rick in the morning paper and how he was selling more books than I had brain cells. I remember I was reading this, and it was about how he was having this great impact all over the world, that one time I had lunch with Rick. This is I got over my crisis about him, but I was having lunch with him because I do know him. And you can't have lunch with Rick Warren, not really in peace. Because 1 in 4 people in Orange County has been to his church. So everybody knows him. So it's like, 30 or 40 people will stop at his table. I'm not exaggerating. It's like every minute, pretty much, somebody stops. And he says, that's the reason I can't go out and eat. And so he has to actually hide a lot of times just to have a conversation with people. But I felt like this inflatable man who had been blown up with hot air of praise. And then when I started reading this article, it's like somebody pulled the plug, and slowly all the air let out of me until I disappeared behind the paper. And I knew something was wrong. And I was a product of my time. And so here's what God said to me. I spent a lot of time praying, and sometimes I would get down on my face in the office and talk to God. And he says to me in so many words, "Don't run, Bill. I'm going to break you." And this very irritating woman came to see me. And she gave me a little book about 70 or 80 pages long called Brokenness. And I couldn't wait for her to get out of my office so I could throw it in the trash. Because if I was going to get broken, it wouldn't be with her, because she irritates me. And I read that little book after she left, and I couldn't stop reading it until I finished it. And then, so I began to experience rejection. People would come to me and say, "We think we're going to leave the church." Why? We don't know. But it was sort of like this low-grade fever. And it was just there. And so some of that was happening. Not enough that maybe people noticed, but I noticed. And so Jane and I decided to go to this retreat. And it was not something I wanted to do, but there were so many people in our church that had gone to it. It's called Breakthrough. And it was called then Breakthrough. I don't know what it's called now. They've changed names a few times. But essentially, it's behavioral exercises. We were 54 of us, and we were in this room, and nobody had a name tag. Like, I can look down and go, Brent. But if I had to, let's say I was with all of you, we were all together, we didn't know each other until we got in the room, and we're going to spend 4 days together in this room, and we didn't have name tags. We didn't know what anybody did. Wouldn't know Dennis was a judge, wouldn't know that I'm a pastor, wouldn't know what any profession was. And then you would just do these behavioral exercises together. And you form this community. So after about 2 days, I'm just appalled at some of these people spilling their guts like they are. It's so disgraceful. And I go, oh, boy, these people have deep problems. And I'm pastor, so I got to be aloof and cool and guarded. And so after the end of the second day, they had an exercise. And the exercise was this. You go around to the other 53 people, and you have about 25 popsicle sticks they give you. And you have to go around to the other 53 people, and you have to say, after I've been with you for 2 days, I have decided you're a giver or a taker. And if you're a giver, I give you a stick. If you're a taker, I just say taker and move on. And plus, if you haven't memorized their name, you have to say, I'm sorry, but I haven't paid enough attention to you to know your name. So I go around the room, and I made one big error. I ran out of sticks before I got to my wife. What do? Didn't have a stick for her. But then they sat us in the horseshoe with the person who got the most sticks in chair 1. And then all the way around to seat 54. And so there I am, standing, looking pretty much in the face of the most caring person, because they were in seat 1. I'm in seat 50. And to my right was my attorney. He was in seat 51. And to his right was my wife, who had all kinds of issues with this process. And so she wouldn't take any sticks. And obviously I didn't have too many either. So my wife finally says something. She'd been there for 2 days. This was the third day. She finally speaks. And somebody criticized her, so I come to her defense. And the guy says, we don't need to hear from you. She can handle it herself. And then what he did was the facilitator said, well, he was talking, and this woman just blurted out, What do you do? And I appealed to the facilitator. I said, I'm not supposed to tell what I do. He said, well, go ahead. This will be fun. I said, well, I'm a pastor. She said, pastor? I said, yes. You mean like you have a church? I said, yes, I have a church. I mean, I have a whole church just to myself. And she said, what are you doing over there? I said, I don't really know. And what God showed me was, I always thought and taught that we are to love as Christ loved. But I discovered something. I had limits on my love. In fact, if you didn't agree with me, I'd write you off. And essentially, Jesus loved us until we got it that he loved us. He was persistent. And so I thought, oh, that means I have to love people until they get it that I love them. It has to be my commitment if I'm going to love as Jesus loved. And so that revolutionized my thinking and my behavior. Because I went back to the congregation and I confessed my sin to them and told them that my new commitment was to love them until they got it that I love them. And, there were some people who put me to the test. There always are. But I think largely I passed the test. And when I resigned a few years later and left, I got a plaque from that church, and it said, we get it that you love us. So, how I got to this point was through this long process. And I believe that's why I say we lead with our weakness. And we lead with Christ as our leader. And so it's, to me, this is the real power in the Christian experience is the ordinary, common things of life. If it's how I treat my wife, my children, my neighbors. To me, the real test isn't whether I can show up in orange and give a talk. The real test is, am I going to watch the rest of this football game or go out on the front porch with my neighbor and spend a little time with him? Those are the kind of decisions that reveal my heart. So, anyway, that's how I got to this point.